All right, well, we'll get things started. Welcome to all to our historic Alexandria lecture tonight. My name is Liz Williams, and I'm the director at Gadsby's Tavern Museum. A few housekeeping things before we get started. To help preserve bandwidth and limit disruptions, you'll notice that all of the audio and video are off, but however, our chat is open. So please use the chat feature throughout the evening to type in your questions at any time. We will use them at the end of our presentation. And make sure you post in the chat to everyone so we can keep our community feel. We are recording this lecture and it will be posted on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So let me welcome Elaine Peña, Associate Professor of American Studies at the George Washington University in DC. Graduate. She received her PhD at Northwestern University in 2006 and accepted postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and Yale University. Dr. Peña's interdisciplinary research has appeared in American Quarterly, Material Religion, the Drama Review, and American Literary History, and has been funded widely through the Ford Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the British Academy. Tonight, I am so excited that she'll be discussing her research from her 2020 publication, Viva George, celebrating Washington's birthday at the U.S. Mexico border. So take it away, Dr. Peña. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Liz. Thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you to Tyler for joining me in conversation. I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and your questions. So I'm going to share my screen now so that I can show you some images. Before I jump into the details of my talk, I want to orient us geographically. So the Washington's birthday celebration that I'm going to be talking about takes place in Laredo, Texas, United States, and Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, Mexico. So you can see the map shows specifically where Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, which I'm going to refer to as the Port of Laredo, on your screen. And you can see it in reference to Mexico and the rest of the United States. So just as kind of a bit of background, the Port of Laredo is a busy place. It's been busy for a very long time because of its location, but specifically in the 1880s, with the advancement of rail technology and the development of rail lines through the Port of Laredo, that spurred unprecedented demographic change and affected life on both sides of the border. So let's start there. That's a good general starting point to jump into the beginning of this story, which starts at the end of the 19th century. On February 22nd, 1898, the city of Laredo, Texas commemorated George Washington's birthday. Members of the Improved Order of Red Men, Yaki Tribe Number 59, a brotherhood originally founded in Baltimore, Maryland in 1834, and whose ideological antecedents include the Sons of Liberty, organized the two-day celebration. Laredo's Red Men split up into committees to oversee transportation, advertising, accommodations, finance, the parade, exhibition, music, and military participation on both sides of the U.S. Mexico border. They orchestrated several events: a parade, a fireworks display, and a night of burlesque. It was the reenactment of the Boston Tea Party in front of Laredo City Hall that attracted thousands of spectators, some of whom traveled from as far away as San Antonio, Texas, and Monterrey, Nuevo León. Onlookers were amazed when the Red Men, costumed in buckskin outfits and smeared in war paint, overtook a 100-foot colonial-era ship built and docked at City Hall. And they were pleasantly surprised when those Indians threw boxes of candy overboard. Thousands of American flags circulated through the crowd, a choir sang the Star-Spangled Banner, and a spectacular fireworks display featuring George Washington's likeness adorned with a halo capped off the celebration. This was perhaps not George Washington's first apotheosis on the U.S. Mexico border, but definitely one of the most sensational. The next morning, J.S. Penn, Redmen member and editor of the Laredo Times, printed the following headline, quote, "Red men are rustlers and doing grand work in Laredo. They will awaken patriotism on the border and make us realize that we live in the United States," end quote. From the outset, Laredo's Red Men clearly defined and articulated their use of spectacle as a differentiation strategy. Founded in May 1897, Yaki Tribe Number 59 was an exclusive club in Laredo. There were only 63 members, names on the inaugural roster in a town with over 13,000 residents. And those men were some of the city's most powerful citizens. Several members of this fraternity arrived in Laredo after the railroad boom in the 80s and had since vied for political office, bought property, taken control of media outlets, helped in place distinct religious sensibilities, pledged allegiance to various societies, and fostered synergistic business relationships on both sides of the border. Early Red Men members like S.N. Johnson, for example, bottled Coca-Cola and Budweiser. J.S. Penn edited the Laredo Times. A. Sanchez was part owner of a stock ranch of 100,000 acres in Tamaulipas. L.J. Christian was mayor. L.R. Ortiz was county sheriff. A.M. Bruni was county treasurer. A.C. Hamilton was district attorney. J. Gilligan ran the beer garden. They all contributed to border commerce in different ways. It is important to note that several initiates already belonged to other fraternities like the Masons, the Knights of Pythias, and or La Sociedad Mutualista Hijos de Juárez, the Sons of Benito Juárez. And many actively praised and tithe as Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians, and Jews. The one factor that unified this cohort was nationality. All were US citizens, born in diverse places, such as Texas, Louisiana, New York, Tennessee, Missouri, and Ohio, but also naturalized citizens, originally from Germany, France, Italy, and Canada. Archival records show that those men did not join Yaki Tribe Number 59 to combat boredom. They did not play Indian, which is what they were doing, to simply pass the time. Following the tenets upheld by the National Improved Order of Red Men organization, which had a very long history of appropriating Native American customs to cultivate venerable American character, a way of being in the world that relied less on cultural ties to Britain and more on the New World sensibilities of indigenous peoples, Laredo's Red Men were keen on emplacing what they felt was a genuine sense of American heritage on the U.S. Mexico border. Moreover, Red Men members at the border and elsewhere throughout the 19th century upheld George Washington as a demigod figure because the fraternity subscribed to the idea that Washington is the first and only white man to be admitted by the Great Spirit into the Indian heaven. This idea was lifted verbatim in their handbook. It was taken from Lewis Henry Morgan's proto-ethnographic work, League of the Iroquois, published in 1851. And I'm happy to talk more about that point in the Q&A. Living in a geographic area that teetered between national identities, American and Mexican, a city physically located in the United States but dominated by Mexican rituals, inspired them to act on a common goal. According to a letter written by Joseph Netzer, one of the most prominent members of this Yaki Tribe Number 59, the inaugural cohort recognized that, quote, it was customary in Laredo to celebrate all kinds of Mexican celebrations, such as Cinco de Mayo, 16 de Septiembre, et cetera, but no American memorials were considered seriously, end quote. Curbing border residents' mañana attitude was also a crucial component of their fraternal work. Xenophobic quirks aside, Laredo's internal political battles, as well as the city's built environment, instantiate some of the ambiguities they may have sought to counter. For example, the streets in downtown Laredo are named Moctezuma, Matamoros, Hidalgo, Juárez, Iturbide, Santa Maria, San Bernardo, San Agustin. And those streets intersected or ran parallel to streets called Washington, Lincoln, Farragut, Houston, Davis, Grant. The inaugural cohort felt compelled to make their patriotic values public, but why did they choose George Washington's birthday? And how did the idea to celebrate George Washington's birthday get to the U.S. Mexico border? George Washington's journey to Laredo began in 1893. So about 5 years before the Boston Tea Party was reenacted. It began in 1893 when Andrew H. Patton, then recently elected Great Incahone, which is the highest ranking official of the National Organization of the Improved Order of Red Men, he instructed red men across the United States to renew their allegiance to George Washington, to commemorate his birthday, iconic scenes from his life, and the fast approaching centennial of his death, which was in 1899. He spearheaded the revival through expressive play scripts, speaking engagements, and a series of official proclamations. All of these mandates were circulated in bulletins and announced with directives, and later reported which tribes had heeded the call. There were dissenters within the fraternity, but their protests were not against celebrating Washington's birthday, but having to finance that holiday in addition to Tamina Day and the 4th of July. Grievances notwithstanding, commemorating Washington on his natal day would become Patton's legacy. Considering the tradition's well-established ubiquity, Patton was late to the game. Echoing the fervor of centennial celebrations, for example, Congress made Washington's birthday a federal holiday in 1879, and they too seemed to be a step behind. According to historian Philip Deloria, as early as the 1840s, societies were already using his natal day, the 4th of July, and reenactments of the Boston Tea Party to, quote, replace carnivalesque, revolution-tinged Indian celebrations with sanctioned holidays in which Indians play transformed wildness of the revolution into an obedient patriotism, end quote. And as religious studies scholar Catherine Albanese notes in her study of the American Revolution, Washington was revered as a, quote, living tribal totem for an emerging nation state even before his death in 1799. Albanese writes, he was good for thinking, for he helped the patriots define the good by embodying it in visible form, end quote. Patton's mandate to commemorate Washington's birthday was a pragmatic and intuitive progression of that nation-building ethos. It was at a tribal council meeting in East Texas where Andrew H. Patton personally related the idea of celebrating Washington's natal day to the eventual founder of the Laredo Medmen tribe, Charles M. Barnes. In March 1896, Patton traveled to Houston to rekindle the first great fire of the Great Council of Texas. Barnes was at that gathering alongside other state-level Red Men members. Reports published in the state council minutes indicate that Barnes was already familiar with the original proclamation to celebrate Washington's birthday. Those documents also relate that he had listened to Patton personally explain the significance of the ceremony. And it seems that Barnes and fellow Texas Red Men carried that knowledge with them on their recruiting trips. And Patton perhaps could not have imagined a better interlocutor. Barnes was a recruiting machine. Between August 1896 and August 1897, he established 5 tribes in disparate locations across Texas. Moreover, as a former newspaperman for the San Antonio Express, as well as the author of a book, Combats and Conquest of Immortal Heroes, Sung in Song and Told in Story, Barnes, like Patton, was a savvy communicator who encouraged the circulation of ideas in print and through storytelling. Barnes often promoted the fraternity's veritable American origins before his visits. In 1896, for example, he used the Dallas Morning News to advertise the Brotherhood's prodigious qualities. He proposed that the Improved Order of Red Men is one of the oldest orders in this country. Its founders were the framers of the Declaration of Independence, and the Boston Tea Party was composed of red men. George Washington, the father of his country, was one of the founders of the order, and in fact, all of the leading American revolutionists were members of it also. While evocative, newspapers and word-of-mouth buzz were not the fraternity's only teaching tools. Paraphernalia, such as adoption books, old cards, and copies of proceedings, also transmitted the fraternity's overarching principles and aspirations. For example, upon induction, every red man acquired an adoption certificate, which you can see on the screen right now, the price of which was routed into supplies and rituals and adoption fees. Akin to a birth certificate, it not only linked the initiate to the fraternity symbolically, but also served as a legally binding document during times of duress, such as death or injury. Using tableau, a popular technique among 19th century societies, it created visual touchstones for new members. The images featured on this standard document give prominence to George Washington alongside heroes such as Tecumseh, and narrated Indian customs like invoking the Great Spirit and hunting buffalo. The tableau acknowledged the fraternity's progenitors and 18th century figureheads. So imagine at the border, a red man initiate studying this adoption certificate at the end of the 19th century would be able to connect with his newfound fraternity family's roots back to the American Revolution. Additionally, by including images of Montezuma, who actually looks more like a Spanish conquistador on this, and Uncas, the emblematic and historical totem, also suggested a Pan-American vision of Indian life that preceded modern European American history. The adoption diploma was particularly efficacious for audiences on the U.S. Mexico border and other multi-ethnic and multilingual areas because it made the fraternity's tenets accessible to spectators whose first language may not have been English and who perhaps were not familiar with U.S. mythos. As well, having to procure official adoption certificates and other paraphernalia from state fraternity officials not only facilitated money transfers, but also established lines of communication between these different red men tribes across the United States. So this was the end of the 19th century. And just to give you an idea of the scope of this and the reach, in 1905, there were red men society tribes in the Philippines and in Panama. So it was definitely expanding across the United States and beyond. Barnes carried adoption certificates, a well-rehearsed version of red men history, patents called to celebrate George Washington's birthday, and a deep appreciation for storytelling on his recruiting trip to Laredo in the spring of 1897. In May of that year, he established Yaki tribe number 59, and that fall, the inaugural cohort began to envision celebrating Washington's birthday. They planned and rehearsed, and when the time came to perform, they put on an excellent show, as I narrated at the beginning of this talk with the Boston Tea Party. And by all accounts, it really was a complete success. The fact that Laredoans and Neo-Laredenses, that is residents of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, continue to celebrate this tradition 124 years later is testament itself. The parade, the reenactment of the Boston Tea Party, Washington's pyrotechnic apotheosis were sensational displays of American identity. They not only commanded the attention of thousands of spectators, but they also established a template for patriotic behavior at the border. Moreover, incorporating George Washington's persona into the inaugural festivities, reenacting epic moments in American history like the Boston Tea Party, using his image to light up the night sky, and having him walk among border residents during the parade, reinforced the idea that he was more than a dead American revolutionary hero, or an important person in someone else's history books. His legend, in fact, was not exclusive to the East Coast. It could thrive at the U.S. Mexico border as well. And I think this last point is where I want us to reflect most on the history, because on one hand, you have this very imaginative, creative acting out ritualization of U.S. patriotism using George Washington as the figurehead. And his legend is not exclusive to the East Coast. So geographically, it can thrive in other places. And I think that this is an important point with contemporary implications. If we can accept that geographies of patriotism and belonging can exceed the places where we think that they are most at home. For example, U.S. history in Philadelphia, U.S. history in Boston, these kinds of icons and images and symbols have a happy place in their happy kind of historical homes geographically. But if we could calibrate that and understand that these geographies of patriotism and belonging have been circulating and thriving in other places, we may be able to shift the way we view the border as just a place of maybe illegality or pathos or violence. It is something much more than that. It shares a lot with other parts of the country. And I do hope that shedding light on this history that may not be well known can help change perceptions of the border so that they just don't attract, or the border just doesn't attract violence or negative perceptions. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to make that point that has contemporary implications in order to get the most out of the history that we just heard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pena. That's that was fascinating, and I really need to see the fireworks display of George Washington's Apotheosis now.
And the halo.
Yes, that I'm clearly taking a field trip now. But I would like to welcome to the floor Tyler Vanice, who is the chair of the George Washington Birthday Celebration Committee. Formed in 1976 here in Alexandria, this volunteer-led committee works to organize and carry out our city's annual celebrations, including our George Washington Birthday Parade, which is back this year in person, February 21st. So with that, I will pass the floor over to Tyler.
Thanks, Liz. Hello, everyone. Dr. Elaine, that was a fantastic talk about George Washington celebration, certainly, and most of its history up to what I would say, early 20th century. My presentation is going to be a little different. It's going to be more history focused for probably 25% of it, but more what we currently do nowadays. So to start, the George Washington Birthday Celebration Committee is one of the oldest community organizations in Alexandria. The city and its organizations have been honoring George Washington since the Revolutionary War period. And whether it's through marches, parades, reenactments, musical performances, dances, etc. Our local citizens here, our community, consider the annual remembrance of the father of our country to be pretty important and a worthwhile endeavor. So, like Liz mentioned earlier, in 1976, the present George Washington Birthday Celebration Committee was formed to carry out the city's annual celebrations. The committee is responsible for planning and carrying out the city's George Washington parades and other festivities. The committee is made up of volunteers and other local organizations who have connections with honoring George Washington. So what we do is we help organize and promote the events throughout the whole city. So there are many ways to promote the legacy and memory of someone. Here in Alexandria, we kind of have both spectrums, and there are more somber ways of doing this, like visiting the tomb of George Washington at Mount Vernon, which is Washington's estate where he's buried, or some more relaxed and less historically accurate ones, like the Cherry Challenge competition, where restaurants compete to create unique cherry dishes, entrees, appetizers, etc. So as mentioned, we help sponsor and run events throughout the whole month. Our main event is the George Washington Birthday Parade, which is held annually on the third Monday of February, Washington's birthday, not President's Day here, which tens of thousands of people come to enjoy, and we get thousands of participants in the parade itself as units. Including the parade, there are multiple organizations who hold programs to honor these festivities, like the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, where they host a symposium gala, the Daughters and Sons of the American Revolutions. They do a joint wreath laying and many more. There are activities for all age groups, from visiting museums free of charge or doing a scavenger hunt for kids, where they walk around the heart of Old Town and try to find clues relating to George Washington if we can, or other historical ideas. So here's a list of just some of the events that currently go on, and many of these are organizations that existed since Washington's time. I'll get a little bit to that later. Oh, going a little far here. Okay, so one of the beautiful aspects is, let me see, one of the beautiful aspects of the celebration is that as a community, we don't need to grasp at trying to find connections with George Washington's. Why? Because we actually have George Washington as a local citizen. He moved here in 1750s and lived here for the rest of his life, and he passed away here. Heck, he was even one of the founding surveyors who helped find the city. So we have a whole lot of reasons to honor George Washington. And as if that wasn't enough, the newlywed Washington started living at Mount Vernon, like I said, in 1759, and he inherited 2 years later. And being a prominent business person, of course, Washington became acquainted with a number of the local businesses and organizations. A number of these organizations still exist, like I said, and many of them honor Washington from 2 slides earlier. I am missing a slide, so sorry about that. So I will just talk a little bit about it. So like the professor said earlier, I'm going to talk into a little bit of the fraternal side of George Washington and the city, simply because that's what I'm more familiar with as well. So Washington was a member of Alexandria Washington Lodge number 22, and he joined in the lodge in 1780s, and he even served as its charter master or first president in 1788. Being a Freemason in the 18th century was kind of expensive. It's not something the average person could afford to be a member of. And so it was mostly prominent members of society who were members. And membership was a lot smaller back then due to the population and the costs associated. So Lodge held him in pretty high regard, as most society had, of course, since 1780s. He had a good name for himself. He was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army at the time, and the Lodge even started honoring him starting 1784, when they gave him an honorary membership to the Lodge. And he served as charter master a few years later in 1788. Once Washington passed away, the Lodge and its members wanted to honor George Washington. And so they started acquiring relics belonging to George Washington. And they actually opened up a museum starting in the early 1800s. They actually have the honor of being one of the first public ones in the country. When he passed away in 1799, the Lodge held a Masonic funeral for Washington, and they placed a wreath at his tomb, and they still continue that tradition, and also placing a wreath on his birthday. And that's been a tradition that the Lodge has never broken since. So that's a long-held tradition. The Freemasons of Alexandria and those around the country continue to support Washington locally by having the Symposium Gala at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. And it receives a couple hundred visitors from around the country each year. So I can get to this current slide now. Probably the most famous Washington icon in Old Town Alexandria is Gadsby's Tavern. Gadsby's Tavern consists of two buildings, a 1785 and a 1792, I believe, city tavern and hotel. The tavern business was central to Alexandria's port-based economy and offered, spaces for dining, entertainment, etc., and spend the night, of course. Counted among Gadsby's famous guests, of course, is George Washington, General Marquis de Lafayette, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, and I believe Thomas Jefferson even held his inaugural ball there. So pretty well reported, certainly. But by the early 1900s, Gadsby's had been renamed as the City Hotel and Tavern and was no longer seen as the fashionable destination it had once been. Over the subsequent decades, the tavern closed and fell into disrepair. In 1928, the American Legion members of the city of Alexandria heard about the rumors that the city actually was going to demolish this historic building. And the American Legion members decided that it was their duty to try to rescue this building, as they saw it as a national historic building, as it should be. And they actually went about trying to purchase it. They raised about $4,000 and had to take a loan of about $14,000. It's probably about $200,000, give or take, for inflation, for its rescue. And eventually, they actually donated it to the city in 1972. Most establishments can't claim that their annual celebration of George Washington's birthday originated with an appearance by the first president himself. But this place, Gadsby's Tavern, has that privilege. Washington attended the event twice, actually, in 1798 and 1799, holding when the Gadsby's actually held a birth night ball in honor of George Washington. And today, Gadsby's Tavern still holds this tradition, and they do it each year, which is probably the most sought after event in Alexandria. Here we have Friendship Veterans Fire Engine Association. The Friendship Fire Company was established in 1774. It was the first company in Alexandria, the first fire company specifically. The members were volunteers, and they were motivated for concern of the safety of property for their community's well-being. And you might ask, what the heck is this connection with Washington? Well, Friendship Veterans Fire Engine Association stated that not only did he serve as the first president, but he was also a volunteer firefighter in 1774, and that he purchased the town's first fire engine. Well, that's at least what they used to say. With a few stories that tie George Washington to the Friendship Fire Company, these are largely myths. They began in about the mid-1800s, after the fire company had ceased fighting fires and were looking to gain membership for its veteran society. Nearly 6 decades after George Washington's death, Charles McKnight, a member of Friendship, started the first rumor that our first president assisted in putting out a fire using the Friendship pump. This and other stories gained popularity, and by the mid-1950s, when the building was dedicated as a shrine to George Washington, the stories were taken as truths and actually became a part of the history of Friendship Fire Company. I mentioned this organization and story because this was a common occurrence in the mid to late 19th century, where organizations would try to make a strong lineage to boost their reputation and membership. The organization recognizes this connection to Washington is false nowadays, and yet they're still able to create a tradition from this idea. From the 1800s to about the 1920s, this company participated in parades honoring George Washington. They made appearances in the city's parades as early as the 1880s, and they even actually traveled up to New York City, actually, to join in the presidential parade in 1889, I believe. They honored Washington by celebrating his birthday, and they still hold on to this tradition each February and continue participating in this event. So this organization created tradition on false premises, but even still, they continue this tradition of honoring their local resident. So that's essentially the end of what I have, because I like to keep mine short and brief. So there's plenty of events that go on throughout the whole city. I only named 3 or 4. It really is about 24 events, I would say, give or take, depending on each year. And so I hope some of you are able to participate in a number of them. So if you have any questions, I'm going to pass this back over to Liz.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tyler, for your presentation and the context of our GWBCC. Before we get started with questions, and again, a reminder, drop your questions in the chat and we will incorporate them for the rest of our lecture. I wanted to share that we are selling Dr. Peña's awesome book. I know Tyler has it at his house. This is my imaginary. There you go. You can go buy her book at Gadsby's or the Alexandria History Museum. So come out when we're open and snag her book. And if you would like your own signed copy, then Dr. Peña can hook you up. So email her. Michelle's going to drop her email in the chat. So you can email Dr. Peña, and since she's super close by GW, you can metro over, grab her book, and get her signed it. Another special guest I would like to welcome to our Q&A, and thank you for this virtual format that we were kind of bummed that we moved it for safety COVID protocols, but it did open up this opportunity to bring in all the peoples. So I wanted to introduce Margarita Ariza. She's the executive director of the Webb County Heritage Foundation in Laredo, and she's going to join us for the Q&A as well. So welcome, Margarita. So first off, I wanted to kind of jump in with an easy question. So what kind of jumped out to you for like the similarities and the differences between the two celebrations of Alexandria, Virginia and Laredo, Texas, and how we celebrate Washington in similar ways and different ways, and how that which ones jumped out to you, thought was cool, different and interesting, that really resonated with you?
Certainly a lot of the commonalities that we would have, as we're both pretty familiar with fraternal organizations. It sounds like they're normally the first in communities to actually rise together and hold events. Normally the first to do most things actually in their communities. So as the frontier expanded, they're normally the first always to do things, and this is no exception. So honoring the first president, of course, in whatever capacity, normally for a fraternal organization, there's going to be a lot of shared bonds, beliefs, and ideals that go with them that kind of bring people together with a shared idea that can allows people to get together and honor or honor people essentially, or an idea of Washington. So I did like hearing, all those fraternal orders, and certainly because that makes sense to me. That would have been my guess as well, without having read the book. So one of the large differences I found between listening to your lecture was actually kind of the idea of what a parade is like. So what I mean by that is, you can have a same idea, like the theme of George Washington, but they could be entirely different. So you mentioned the Apotheosis of Washington. Well, I'll use that as a perfect example. They're honoring the first president. Well, here in Alexandria, we honor him more as a local citizen aspect, so less president. And so that idea alone kind of allows, at least in my aspect, more of a community involvement, right? So as a local citizen, you can have these various businesses kind of come together, tie together, versus coming together for the military aspects of Washington or a demonstration, etc. So that's kind of what I found, at least in that regard.
Margarita, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Okay. Hi, everybody. From Laredo, Texas. Yeah, our celebration down here is, I would say, completely different. It has more the flavor of a gigantic party, and that is, you know, very much the dominant theme, and it's also extremely, I mean, as Elaine describes in her book, it was very early on, sort of, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Elaine, but I think it was co-opted by the Mexican ethnic citizens of Laredo and became very much a Mexican type celebration with George Washington as the figurehead, but it has been transformed completely into a very, very Mexican themed type of celebration.
Yeah, I think I agree totally with you, Margarita, and with you, Tyler. Like you, Tyler, I noticed the fraternity connections. I mean, even choosing the businessmen of some town, trying to recruit them, right? It's the same dynamic. And I appreciate your point about seeing George Washington less as a demigod figure than as somebody who is, you know, flesh and blood right next to us, you know, was here, volunteered, you know. So I love juxtaposing those two Washingtons because they're the same Washington. He just, people just choose different aspects of his persona to celebrate. And then to Margarita's point, yes, absolutely. You know, for all the reasons that the inaugural cohort said we need to celebrate George Washington's birthday beyond the mandate to celebrate his birthday, they really did want to Americanize the border. That they wanted to remind people that the soil underneath their feet was the United States, not Mexico, not anymore. And of course that didn't hold. And that shift happened with when the Improved Order of Red Men as a fraternity couldn't hold on anymore. They couldn't keep up with all of the responsibilities, the planning responsibilities of Margarita saying a gigantic cross-border binational party. So once they stepped out of a leading role and the city of Laredo took over through the Chamber of Commerce and the establishment of the Washington's Birthday Celebration Association, that's when the door opened for less of a focus on American identity and more of a border identity with George Washington as the figurehead. But as I explained in the book, all of this wasn't necessarily targeted to boost patriotism. At the end of the day, this binational celebration protects that port's economic interests, right? So you can use a tradition, have it symbolize something, and have that be good for business. So we ask ourselves, how is it that these American and Mexican values can thrive and morph and be friendly about it with George Washington as the figurehead? That's one of the reasons why.
Well, my next question actually kind of ties in with this identity and this identity concept. So for each community, the celebration of George Washington's birthday has become, you know, part of this local tradition, whether it's rooted in truth or urban legend. And, you know, one of the ways the community really identifies itself. So I wonder if we all can talk a little bit more about how this identity of George Washington and our individual communities have really become intertwined with this, with his story and the intention behind this celebration. It's like a deep question.
Yeah, no, I mean, just off the top of my head, you know, it's much more than the parade, and it's much more than the Society of Martha Washington pageant. This kind of generating this familiarity with George Washington happens while kids are still young. There are workshops where George Washington, someone portraying George Washington and other colonial characters go to elementary schools in Laredo to teach them about history and to teach them about George Washington. all throughout the history of the celebration, there has always been a component that has been targeted or kind of focused on children. I can say so much more, but I think I'll just throw that out there as a starting point of how this kind of unfolds in a very kind of in different ways beyond the celebration.
Well, let me see. For us, let me think here. So locally, because we have so many connections to George Washington, and it's just, where do I even start? So how's the community changed over time? Okay, so because we have all these organizations that were actually influenced by Washington in some fashion, I guess I'm going to kind of go down an economic route here. So because they have all these historic sites still surviving with Washington, the city of Alexandria as a whole should continue the preservation of these buildings, and it becomes essentially a tourist attraction, right? So we have George Washington's estate, we have Gadsby's Tavern, we have Duval, we have so many buildings relating Christ Church where he attended. So I'll just use Mount Vernon for now. So people want to honor George Washington, and they could do it certainly any time of the year. But certainly it's most noticeable here in February, of course. So Mount Vernon attracts millions of visitors each year. And so it's just kind of funny in a way that like George Washington kind of is financially supporting the city of Alexandria centuries after his passing, right? It's because it's all money going back into the local economy. So I just find something like that kind of unique. And so with that, because we know Washington month, February for us is large with that, it also expands to the whole community at large because organizations kind of band together knowing that these are large attractions. So it just spurs the local community in more ways than one, I guess.
Well, with the joys of technology nowadays, we at Gadsby's, we were the host of George Washington's birthday ball in 1798 and 1799. So George did party in our ballroom, and our large event, the birthday ball in February, we teach 18th century dancing. So, if the school kids in Laredo would like to learn, English country dancing in their classrooms, call us. We can certainly zoom in to share some of the the basic steps of what George Washington whipped around on the dance floor, because he was a very good dancer, and they partied until 2 o'clock in the morning. We do have some good primary documents of his 2 balls at Gadsby's, and his step granddaughter did say they danced until 2 o'clock a.m. So so we can certainly teach the kids in Laredo how to dance George Washington style. We had a question in the chat. So what does the Laredo event look like today, and the different what are the different type of events that you are hosting down there?
Yeah, well, it's very there are some things that have been pretty constant since 1898, such as the International Parade, fireworks display, but now again, to push the economic story here, right? It's over a month long. There are, help me out, Margarita. There are how many events? 25 plus?
There's just almost every day something going on during that month, and they've already started. It has started. In fact, it starts in January now.
Yeah.
With the announcement and what they call the commander's reception, where they pull out all the characters that will participate, like the Princess Pocahontas, and of course George and Martha, and Mr. South Texas. There's all these ancillary characters that are now a very big part of the whole celebration. But yeah, there's fireworks, there's a carnival, there's a jalapeno festival, there's a Stockman's Ball, there's a tequila tasting party. There's something almost every day in that month.
Yeah, and then probably the most important one, at least for my research, is the International Bridge Ceremony, right? Where two children representing Mexico physically meet two children representing the United States in the middle of the international bridge, one of the international bridges at Laredo. And they're dressed in colonial garb. The kids representing the US and the kids representing Mexico are dressed in traditional Mexican garb, such as a charro. And that probably is the jewel of the celebration now. That's the element of the celebration that attracts attendees with political power. It becomes a stage to promote certain types of issues. So there is a lot of activity that is enjoyed by hundreds of thousands of people on both sides of the border, but there is still a very elite aspect of the celebration, such as the bridge ceremony, such as the Society of Martha Washington pageant, such as the Princess Pocahontas pageant, that have ties to the earlier part of the celebration. They continue to happen, but those aren't really open to all. So you have a you have a way that even with these rituals and even with how expansive it has become, it is still cutting across different sectors of the population on both sides of the border. I think it's very important to state that as well. But yeah, there's a lot going on. It's over a month, and definitely you can, if you know about the history of it, if you know of what the Improved Order of Red Men intended, you can still see elements of that even today in the way that the rituals play out.
So I actually have a question, if you don't mind then. So would you say fraternal societies still play a large role in the current celebrations? So for instance, because I work at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, and so I'm intimately familiar with the fraternal aspects, at least on that regard. And I know with the Masonic aspects locally here, that turns this community event into a national event as we get hundreds of Masons from around the country to attend. And I was actually talking to the Freemasons in Texas, actually, a couple weeks ago. They sent actually a request because they wanted to actually bring the Masonic aspect of that's Washington related down to them. What I mean by that is we have relics, like I said earlier, that George Washington actually owned and used. And so they sent out a request to borrow those items. And we haven't confirmed it yet. I still might actually go to Laredo in 2 weeks for the Friday and Saturday, because I have to handhold these, right? Because they belong to George Washington, to show around for those events actually. So now that would be the first time, at least to the Masonic side's knowledge, that there would be a large national Masonic aspect to it. Was there, I guess back to my question, is there still at least a fraternal large aspect that, that plays a role in today versus 100 years ago with how it started?
Yeah, it isn't. There's still some connections to, now it's called the Order of Red Men.
Yep. They
have their base in Waco, and they do sponsor an award for a volunteer that is presented during one of the luncheons. So they don't organize anything. They don't have a hand in kind of any decisions, but they're still symbolically, in terms of acknowledging the fraternity's initial role in starting, the tradition of celebrating George Washington's birthday. Tyler, I think that that's absolutely incredible. So it makes me think about, because there's a civil religious aspect to this, right? That the Improved Order of Red Men were drawing on to understand George Washington as someone more, someone worth commemorating, of course, but someone also worth emulating, right? And it just seems very, very interesting to me that taking relics, physical remnants, artifacts of his life, his physical life, and having that be transported to another place in his honor really seems to me like it's picking up on some of those civil religious sensibilities. And that's absolutely fascinating to me.
It is. So I hope that the Grand Master of Texas, Brad Billings, gets back hold of me. Still waiting. So just waiting to hear the okay. So we'll find out.
There's also a group, the Shriners always participate every year in the parade. And then there's a group called the Rough Riders. I'm not sure exactly where they're from, but they participate every year.
No, that's exciting. At least locally here, the Shriners are also involved with our Washington parade, and it's actually one of the things the local community enjoys because they drive around in their little vehicles,
Yes.
with their little fezzes. So that's the talk of the town for the parade.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we have a specific question for Margarita on how you got involved in the celebration, and a lot of these events involve people of all ages. So if this is something that you've participated in all your life, or if it's something that you picked up when you became the executive director.
Well, I'm not directly involved, but I work for a historic preservation organization. So yes, we have a lot of archival collections, photographs, and files and documents, etc., that pertain to the celebration. But personally, everybody is part of that celebration. If you grew up in Laredo, I grew up in downtown Laredo, so the parade used to go right by, a few blocks away from my house. You could hear the marching bands practicing early in the morning before the parade started from my house. So everybody has personal stories, recollections of at least the parade, if not multiple other events, from childhood.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to my last question for the evening. So I think, over the course of the evening, we've heard kind of this evolution of the event and kind of how it started and how it's evolved for the community. So I wonder if each of you could speak to, at its root, what resonates most with you about these celebrations and the importance it is to your respective community.
Sure. So for me, at least, to me, it really goes back to the foundation for what it means for us locally, which is, like I said earlier, we're not honoring all these other crazy aspects that, Washington that rightfully deserves, right? Being first president and all that. But for us, it's the local citizenship that we have with him, being the Alexandrian resident. And being that he was local, there was just so many ways that as a community they can all just get involved. Washington was a fisherman and he liked distilleries, right? So that allows the local fishermen's boat clubs and all that, all these various organizations, breweries, etc., to get involved with something that they normally wouldn't be able to. And it's just that connection on a broader scope that really brings the community together, at least locally for us. And that's what the whole event, at least in my opinion, is about, getting the community together to commemorate and honor our first president, but first and foremost, Alexandrian resident, George Washington.
Yeah, I think, and my perspective on this is that, celebrating George Washington's birthday at the border on both sides of the border is something we should all definitely hold on to. And one of the specific things that I think really just is a telltale detail is that this celebration is massive, over a month long, multiple events, millions of dollars, over 100 years of history. And it just doesn't happen during the month of February. You need planning all year round. And much of that planning, depending on circumstances, involves people from both sides of the border. So actually, you know, celebrating George Washington's birthday, even, you know, with a kind of reciprocal vision of Mexican patriotism with Miguel Hidalgo on the bridge, all of that serves a purpose because it keeps people in dialogue. And during moments of crisis, such as environmental disasters or even a shared threat of violence, those same channels can be used to solve problems. So it is something that grew out of the fraternal orders, you know, impulse to Americanize the border, but actually today it is a very good bi-national platform for communication that serves the purpose of commemorating George Washington's birthday, but can also be used in other circumstances.
Well, I'd like to reiterate what Elaine just said. It is a massive party celebration that involves two countries, two cities that happen to be in two countries. Despite the fact that it was created to instill a sense of American identity, you can't help in Laredo being a bicultural citizen. And that is what this celebration has become. And so now we have buy-in from a population that is technically not American, not American, U.S. American, that buy in just as much, they're all in to celebrating this annual celebration with us. And that's a beautiful thing. That is what we need more of throughout the entire country.
That's an amazing way to end tonight. And I clearly feel there needs to be partnerships with your tequila tasting and George Washington's whiskey here in Alexandria. So
Yes.
we'll start planning that for, you know, next year. I feel that there's some good synergy there.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much again for joining us tonight. And I've honestly been looking forward to this evening for years. When I first discovered, you know, Dr. Peña's research, and I was like, this is so fantastic because we celebrate George and Laredo, Texas celebrates George, and it's a great way to find some commonality and experience George Washington's birthday. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Just to give, we don't quite have a month-long pile of events, but we do have a ton. So I know we've dropped in the chat the George Washington Birthday Celebration Committee website. So we have a chocolate tasting. We don't have jalapenos, but we have chocolate for this month. Of course, the virtual birth night ball will be February 19th, and we're actually going to be exploring the history of the birth night ball in Alexandria from its 18th century to the 20th century. So, and then of course, dancing in your home. Priorities there. And then of course I had mentioned parade day on the 21st. Gatsby's will be open as well as the apothecary that day. So so much George Fest in the month of February, and I hope to see you around the city in Alexandria. And again, thank you for joining us this evening, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it.